Good afternoon, folks. I, Seena Kalghatti, Assistant Professor, takes immense pleasure in welcoming Mr. Neerav Jain as guest speaker, who is here to share his insights and put light on the arena of cyber security. And he will be speaking on weapons of modern warfare. To begin with, Neerav is our proud alumnus. He graduated his Bachelor's of Engineering in the year 2015. He pursued his Master's in Cybersecurity at the University of Southern California 2017. He is presently working as security engineer at LinkedIn, San Francisco Bay Area. He has been associated as security engineer with some top-based companies, US-based companies like F5 Networks, GE Digital, Securonix, and Intel Corporation. His top skills comprise public key cryptography, Java, and C. Highest committed student, British parliamentary debate, BITS, autonomous life following robot are few to mention that Neerav has been honored with. Happy to have you, Neerav.
Thank you, ma'am. It's a pleasure.
Participants, I request you are required to adhere to code of conduct. Any queries can be posted in the chat box. Neerav, can I take a moment and ask you, would you prefer to take the questions as and when asked or at the very end?
So what I'll do is instead of taking it as and when they appear, they can always put them in the chat, and I will make sure that after every breakpoint that I can reach, I'll stop and take some questions.
How are they?
Does that sound good?
It is not audible. Neerav, you are not audible, sorry.
I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Neerav.
Perfect.
So
I was saying
I
that
asked you whether you would prefer to take the questions as and when asked or at the very end.
right, for the questions, if you could concile them together, and I will make sure that I stop every 5 to 10 minutes to look at the questions. We'll address them as and when possible, and we'll move forward that way. And we'll definitely keep some time in the end to kind of go over the questions that we were not able to get to it at the beginning.
Thank you. Yes. Over to you, Neerav. All yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much, ma'am. So just to give you a quick introduction of who I am and what I'm really doing. So my name is Neerav Jain. I graduated from GIT in the year 2015, post which I started my master's in cybersecurity at the School of University of Southern California here in LA. And I've been ever since working in the domain of cybersecurity after my master's. So for today, I wanted to speak to a topic not so well touched. I think a lot of winter school, I was looking at other discussions that were going around, had a lot of focus around what security is, what cybersecurity is, what kind of careers we can have. And those are all very great topics to kind of listen to or understand. I wanted to touch this problem from a different aspect, for which I chose this topic of, I know the name seems intimidating, but when we start looking into this, I'll get to what I really mean by this and how is it applicable in terms of cyber warfare. So weapons of modern warfare is a topic where we're trying to evaluate how cybersecurity or how our current systems will have implications on large-scale infrastructures, physical infrastructures, and that could cause real-world problems. All right. So here's the agenda. This is a very rough agenda that I have ongoing. Feel free to interrupt me at any time where necessary. And if you have questions, we'll definitely address them when we get to it. So the very first thing I want to do is introduce what cybersecurity is, assuming that everybody who's attending this call has some precursor knowledge about this. But regardless, I just want to do like brush upon what are we trying to target and what are we trying to talk about today. So cybersecurity textbook definition of that is cybersecurity is the practice of protecting systems, networks, and programs from unauthorized access. So basically designing systems and giving them controls in an access in a policy defined manner, where a user of that machine or that network is able to do only what is defined in the policy, instead of doing things that are not defined or are outside the scope of the policy. So that is what cybersecurity is all about in a nutshell. And there are various branches that cybersecurity encompasses, and that's not something that we'll be addressing today. We'll be looking at a very niche use case of how a particular attack on an infrastructure system can take place and what are the ramifications of the same. But before we get to that, I just wanted to introduce some very basic concepts so that if people here have not touched base or are not from security domain, it's a good refresher so that they have some context going into this particular use case that we're discussing today. The first thing that I wanted to bring up here is the security triad. This is like a holy grail of all cybersecurity textbooks. So the first thing that we would learn is three things that are most important in a secure system. That is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It's also known as the CIA triad. And this pyramid is most critical for infrastructure systems, where if any compromise on any one of these aspects would lead to a breach in the system. And we'll get to what that means in just a little bit. The three aspects that we just defined are confidentiality. That means that you keep your data out of the wrong hands. This means you implement some form of authentication, some form of access control, so that the user who is intended to use the data or the information, only that person has access to it and nobody else. Integrity, very important, is keeping the data from being modified. It's very important to have trust in the system, and when there's so much information flowing around systems and cross systems, it's very important to acknowledge that this data, while it's moving around so many bits and pieces of the system, has not changed, for which we need to maintain integrity of the data. And we use different kind of hash functions to kind of achieve this. But in a nutshell, what integrity means is like keeping data intact as the author intended till the destination is reached. The next part of this system is availability. Availability is key because if, regardless of how secure your system is or how well you built your system is, if it is not available, it is all meaningless. So that is why keeping the system running and reachable at all times is very important. And at all times is a key emphasis here, because there are times when you can keep it available, but under attack or under certain circumstances, if it is not available, that is when the whole system collapses, and that's when you would call your system is not secure anymore, because it's not able to honor the security triad at that time. All right, moving forward. Some of the terminologies. This is just to get you some basic sense of the verbiage that we'll be using going forward. So this is just a quick refresher so that you understand what I'm trying to talk about. The number one word that you will hear about in security domain is vulnerability. And a lot of times it's easy and often mistaken for what security, in security, what does vulnerability, threat, and attack mean? So I just wanted to define this very clearly before we get started with ending. So think of vulnerability like a door in your house, which you can leave open. So when you leave a door open, that means somebody can get inside that door. Does not necessarily mean that somebody will. That means that there is a potential that somebody could get in. So that is a weakness in your system. That is what we define as a vulnerability. A threat is a potential violation of security, and includes capability of exploiting a vulnerability. What this means is anybody with the knowledge of a vulnerability is a potential threat. That means if somebody passes by that door and sees that door is open, now that person indeed becomes a threat, because that person has the knowledge of the vulnerability and can exploit that vulnerability at any point in time if he or she chooses to. So that becomes a threat to a system. So that is what we mean by threat and vulnerability. The next thing is an attack. So this is the actual attempt to violate the security. So the person who saw that the door was open may or may not attack the system necessarily, but that person is still considered a threat. But when a person actually decides, a person or a machine decides to actually attempt to violate a security of a system, that is when the manifestation of the threat is realized. And this can happen in terms of interception, modification, or disruption. So think of it like somebody is trying to exploit a vulnerability that existed. And that is when we call that this is an attack. So once we're clear with the terminology, let's go ahead with a few more that I want to cover before we get to the use case that we're trying to target today. All right. So the first one is called denial of service. This is very similar to distributed denial of service. This is nothing but a cyber attack in which a perpetrator seeks to make a machine, network, resource unavailable to its intended user by temporarily or indefinitely disrupting the service of a host connected to a network. What this really means is a lot of times you might have experienced that you're trying to visit a website and you see server error, HTTP code 500 returned to you. That means that the service is not available to you. And this could be because of two reasons. A, the system crashed, and that is why the service is not available, or there was an extraneous amount of traffic that was directed towards the server, and the server could not handle the load, and the server collapsed. So under scenario 2, that is called the denial of service. So if an actual intended user is denied service because of an action of an attacker or an adversary, that would be classified under that would be classified under denial of service attack. A distributed denial of service is just a complicated manner of saying that the same attack is happening from multiple sources or from different identities, so that it becomes more difficult to kind of defend against or protect yourself or your systems against. So these are worst form of attacks that we've known so far. It depends case to case. So just an extension to this, applying this to a telephone system, we call it as TDOS. That's nothing but a telephony denial of service. That means flooding, exactly the same mechanism, but instead of targeting a server machine, at this point, we would target a telephone service. So this means a flood of malicious inbound calls that target public safety response systems such as 911 or 108 in that reference. So what this does is a lot of calls would be made to a particular service so that when an actual user who really wants to get to that service will not be able to get it, because the service is going to be busy or being crashed or being unavailable. So this is nothing but classified as TDOS. The next thing we want to discuss here is malware. So malware is, think of malware like a very specific use case software that is designed to disrupt, damage, or gain unauthorized access to a computer. So the intent behind a malware may not always necessarily be good. It's just a special purpose software. It doesn't look different. It doesn't feel different. It's just designed to do bad things. That is all that malware really means. Backdoor. This is a very interesting concept. So if you've been around the Red Hat, White Hat hacker domain, you would have come across this term called backdoor. So a hacker, as important as it is for a hacker to get into a system, it is more important for that hacker to establish a backdoor. So a backdoor would be basically setting up an access to a machine. Authorized or unauthorized users are able to get around a normal security measure and gain high-level access. And that could sometimes mean root privileges on a computer system, network, or a storage application. So what this means is when an attacker is able to infiltrate into one of the systems or the network, they usually try and install a backdoor so that next time around, they wouldn't have to struggle so much to get into a system. They can always use a backdoor channel that they just installed to get inside the system next time around. So that just makes it easier. Sometimes the attacker also uses it to lease it to other bad people. So for example, I get into a system or a network, I can now rent this as a service to other people or sell this on the black market so that other people can gain access to that system. So if I'm not able to exploit the system to its full potential, somebody else will be able to, and I'll be able to make monetary benefits out of it. So that's the whole purpose of having a backdoor. Few more, I promise this is the last slide. There's not going to be a lot of taxonomy here. VPN, I think most of us are going to be familiar with it, but regardless, I just wanted to touch base with everybody here. Virtual private network simply puts a computer or a machine that's trying to access a network inside the network. Though it's an extension of the network, that may at times be over a public or a private network. So what this does is this technically means that your machine is going to be part of that network, but it's going to be remote. It's going to be over a public Wi-Fi or a public internet connection. This is used in most cases to kind of prevent normal access to critical systems. So certain critical systems are hidden behind or kept behind a VPN wall, so that only when you're within the network, you're able to have access to that particular critical system. So the next one is new. I'm not sure if many people must have touched base on this. This is called SCADA. So this is, think of it like a actual machine that kind of controls integral systems. So the textbook definition of this would be control system architecture comprising computers, network data communications, and graphical user interface for high-level supervision of machines and processes. So one good example of this would be a traffic monitoring system that you could find at your local traffic substation, where they monitor all the CCTV cameras from all across the city or the town that they're monitoring. So this is a huge interface that controls or looks at a lot of smaller control systems, or sometimes is also controlling those control systems. The next one is a Windows domain controller. We don't necessarily need to get into the details of what it really is. It's a complicated mechanism, but a very high level understanding of this would be it is simply a server system, a computer that is used to authenticate users, stores user information, and enforces security policies for Windows domain. So this is very specific to Windows domain controller. This is basically the centerpiece of any Active Directory that you must have used for authentication purposes. All right, so with that out of our way, we now have some basic understanding of the terms that we're going to be using going forward in this particular presentation. I just wanted to stop here and see if you have any questions around at this time. If not, we can go ahead. Ma'am, would you be able to take a look at the questions? If there are any.
So far, there is no questions, Neerav. You can
Perfect,
just move ahead.
Got it. Thank you. All right. All right. So this is just to draw a basic baseline of what the real motivation behind an attacker could be. These are just fine-tuned guesses. There could be other reasons why an attacker is trying to get into a system or wants to hack into a system. The first one is very silly and simple. That's nothing but bragging rights. So you would see a bunch of teenagers are able to get through some of the security controls of a system, and they just want to brag about it, saying, hey, I was able to do this. I was able to get into a system. I was able to do this without the necessary authentication required using some of the off-the-shelf tools, or they were able to write some small script themselves. So that's very naive and is not very harmful at most times, I would say. So that gives them the bragging rights to kind of say that, hey, I was able to achieve something which was not intended to. The next one we have is revenge, a little more harsh in terms of implications, revenge or to inflict damage. So in this case, the attacker or the adversary has malicious intent in which they wish to take revenge or they want to inflict damage on a system or a person emotionally or physically. The next one is a service outage. This is very similar to the denial of service attack that we just discussed a while ago. So this is intended to take down a service temporarily or indefinitely based on how critical that machine is and how sophisticated the attack is. The next one we have is extortion. So this would be in the classification of ransomware. So if I install some form of ransomware on your machine and it will give you a pop-up saying, hey, you need to transfer X amount of money to this particular bank account. If not, the account, your computer is locked forever. And at that point, the attacker would actually use some form of encryption on your hard drive. So even if you unplug your computer from your, even if you unplug the hard drive from your computer and try to plug it in another machine, you wouldn't have access to your system. So this is in a way extorting you for money or any other cause. Financial benefits, breaking into systems and trying to transfer money or ordering things on e-commerce website. Those are all classified under financial benefits of the attackers. This is very simple type of fraud and very commonly found. You must have seen, heard, or experienced something of this form. Espionage or terrorism. This is more state-sponsored or nation-state attacks. not something that you hear about very often, but it happens more often than you'd like to think. These are a high level, and this involves a high level of sophistication. Also, these are very well-funded attacks. So espionage is nothing but spying over other party. That could be sometimes political parties. It could be countries spying on each other, companies spying on each other for intellectual property. That also bleeds into the next one. That is the intellectual property theft. All sorts of malicious bad actors trying to spy or basically get information from some other third party would use espionage. IP theft, a very common form of hack that people get into systems for intellectual properties, and they try to replicate it. That would hamper the brand that they're trying to get it from, or they would have monetary benefits behind this. Again, bleeding into our financial benefits side of things. The last one is social and political attackers. So this is more into getting into your Facebook feeds or your social handles and then trying to cause damage that way. A lot of times this would also bleed into financial benefits, but not necessarily. Political attackers are also a new breed of attacks that are found very lately, where very sophisticated attacking tools are used to kind of spy into your political opponent, or even geopolitical locations where you spy into other countries, important members or VIP members to get sensitive information. So those are all examples of political attackers. All right. So let's discuss some of the flaws that we have in our existing system. And these are very high level. This is also not an extensive list, but very common type of attacks. I know that one of the sessions that we've had in this Winter School of Cybersecurity was OWASP Top 10. Those are something to kind of look out for when you're looking at web applications. Those are some of the top critical bugs that we see in application servers. For the purpose of this discussion, we are trying more holistic approach to see what are the common weaknesses that we have or flaws in security. So the number one on that spot is buggy code. So that is just us developers being very lazy at times, and are intentionally or unintentionally having a bug in the code that causes security vulnerability. And vulnerability is nothing but revision of that is, it means that there is an open door that somebody could walk into. Will somebody do that? Not necessary, but they have the potential to walk into. The next one is protocol design failures. So a lot of protocols were designed back in the day when internet was not as popular, machines were not as compute intensive. And at that time, some protocols were designed for looking at the current circumstances. So it may not be the intent of the protocol to be weak, but at the time that was sufficient. And hence those protocols have security flaws inbuilt into them. One of those flaws is in the mobile networks that we currently use. And that is why we recently have SMS being deprecated, and we are now moving towards RCS for Android world, and for iOS, we already have iMessages. So those are some examples of flawed protocols or failures and security failures in the protocol design themselves. All right, so the next one we have on the list is weak cryptography. What this really means is that a lot of cryptography algorithms that were designed back in the day over the period of time have found that compute power has grown immensely and exponentially. So that makes those crypto systems weak. One good example of that would be RSA. We've now moved to AES 256 or even AES 512 for cryptography. Social engineering. This really goes back to the weakest chain in the security system. That's the human. That's considered as the weakest link of any secure system. Social engineering is a very complex problem to solve because it involves human and not machines. So here somebody would come talk to you, and over that conversation would just get critical piece of information out of you. So if I were to just meet you in a party, talk to you about, hey, when is your birthday? Where do you live? Some information like that. and then use that information to kind of break into any of your accounts. Try to guess your passwords with your birthdays or important dates that I was able to extract from meeting you in person, or just trying to social engineer over the phone, where people give you a call and say, hey, I'm calling from XYZ services, and we just need to verify your accounts. Can you just provide us with your debit card information and the CVV and the expiry? And a lot of people fall for it. Surprisingly, even people who are from the security industry many a times are seen falling for this social engineering. And this also compromises, regardless of how secure your system is built, if you're going to give away the credentials and the two-factor, if any, that defeats the entire purpose. Insider threat. So a lot of people, again, people who are working for the company or for a firm end up compromising on their ethics and compromise the system from within. A lot of secure systems are designed in ways that they are immune to having threat actors from the outside. However, systems are not prone to handling insider threats. So that means a person who has insider access decides to go rogue or do malicious thing in the system, there is very little that can be done to kind of control these kinds of threats. And they kind of usually are able to get away with whatever they're trying to achieve with very little inference. Next is poor configuration. Again, this is just overlooking a lot of things, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional. This is when you're configuring a piece of software and you just take the default settings, for example, or when you're setting up SSL connections and you kind of save the least secure configuration for that particular setup, that leaves out a lot of things open and a lot of vulnerability to be exploited. Incorrect policy specification. Again, policy clearly defines what one can achieve in a system and what one cannot. So in an event, the specification says that certain user has access to this, and when implementing it, you're implementing that regardless of what the user has access to or not, you're still able to grant them access. That would be read out as incorrect policy specification implementation. The next one we have here is stolen keys. You can think of it like your car keys are stolen. There's very little that you can do at that point. So here the reference is to cryptographic keys or identities, where if your cryptographic keys are compromised or stolen, the systems that the keys open doors to will be authenticated by the person who kind of got hold of your keys. So the best way to do or get around this is rotate your keys, refresh all the tokens that you've been using. But if the attacker is quick, he or she would still be able to get away with it. Again, our very favorite distributed denial of service attack. Like I mentioned, that these kind of attacks are very difficult to handle just because of the nature of the attack. It's very difficult to tell organic traffic meaning the good users who are trying to access the system from the bad actors. The bad actors will do everything in their power to mimic a good user's request to the server. And in that case, it becomes very difficult to identify which of these two requests is really bad, which of them is coming from a human, which of them is coming from a bad actor bot. All right, so that's pretty much all that I wanted to talk about in terms of precursor before we actually dive into the cyber attack that we wanted to discuss today. I'll take a moment here to see if we have any questions. Ma'am?
Yes, Neerav, we have a question here from Naitik ST. So which kind of cyber warfare could happen in future, like the technology used to launch the attacks?
All right, so we might be getting ahead of ourselves. One of the things that we want to discuss today is in the second half of this particular presentation, where we actually go over one of the cyber attacks that happened over Ukrainian electrical grid. We'll discuss that. So we might want to revisit this question if it's still unanswered after the second half of the presentation. If not, I think you should just hold on to this particular set of questions. I'll be answering it soon. Do we have anything else?
No, Neerav.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So in this part of the presentation, I would actually like to go over an actual cyber attack that happened in the past. This was the year 2015, and this is happening in Ukraine. Who did it is still out in the air, and a lot of allegations at this point. But how it happened is what we will look at today. All right. So here's a quick overview. In short, this is what happened. On 23rd of December 2015, hackers remotely compromised information systems of 3 major energy providers of Ukraine, disrupting electricity supply to residents of Ivano-Frankivsk region of Western Ukraine. Most affected were consumers of Perkarpati Oblenergo, that's a tough one, servicing 30 substations. So that is huge. Just to give you a perspective of it, there were about 2.3 million people that were left out of electricity for a good 6 hours. Also remember that this is happening in Ukraine in the month of December, which is very, very cold for them. So if the heaters were run by electricity and they were out for 6 hours, a lot of casualty would just be noted because of that outage, if nothing more. They don't have to actually launch a weapon, go into anybody's houses or kill anybody. They would be able to inflict enough damage just by taking out the power from their houses. So that is what we're discussing here. All right. So
Neerav,
here's. Mhm.
sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Could you take a question now, or should I?
Yeah, of course.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. It's from Khush. Sir, can there be a flaw in if the system is totally managed, totally robotic, and there's no human interference in that?
Yeah, so I would like to give you a very dubious answer here. So most systems are at this point not humanly managed, or there's very little to no human intervention. So for example, when you visit google.com or any of the websites, most of your interaction is happening with the system in mostly automated fashion. There is no human servicing your request, approving your authentication, or granting you access. At this point, you're pretty much totally, in your terms, robotic. However, we still see that there are security flaws in these systems. And time and again, you will see one of the things that we did not discuss is called CVE. So where a vulnerability, common vulnerability exposure number is assigned when a new vulnerability is found. And we oftentimes see, regardless of what system that is going to be, we always see vulnerabilities on the systems, even if it is totally managed by automation and no human intervention at all. Because at the end of the day, you have to remember that these systems are built and returned by humans, regardless of how automation only comes in or kicks in when you want to solve the problem at scale. So say, for example, a human can solve maybe 10 requests per minute. Same thing, a machine will be able to do maybe 10 billion requests per second. So you're only scaling the problem rather than doing it any differently by the machine. You still have to code in or write the rules in your code, how the particular system would interact with a human request. And there could always be flaws with that because we are prone to having buggy code, some oversight, edge cases, security vulnerabilities in the underlying tools or libraries that are being used. So yes, short answer is yes, that's still possible.
Neerav, Khush has another question. He's asking, is there any system that cannot be attacked?
Attacked? I think every system can be attacked. I think what he meant was could not be breached.
Yeah, true.
Right. So there was, I don't remember the year, but I think somewhere back in so don't quote me on this, but 1970s, we had a system called Multics, MULTICS, Multics. And that was considered as the most secure system ever built on the planet. And ever since then, every system that's been built, yes, that definitely can be breached. And I actually have a quote on that 2 slides down that says, regardless, security is just a perception of time. If given enough time, every system can be breached. And that's the first thing that you will learn in any cybersecurity class, that no system is secure. And that's why we always measure security in terms of relative terms, that this system is more secure than some other system or some reference points that we have. We never say a system is 100% secure. And if somebody's telling you that, that person is lying.
Right.
All right.
Thanks.
Do we have any other
We
questions?
can move ahead, I think. Yes. Any participant want to pose another question, please? You can put it in the chat box. Yes, Neerav. Sorry to interrupt again. Yes, we can
Sure,
move
not
ahead.
a problem. Happy to take a question. All right. So this particular attack is very near and dear to me. That's why I wanted to talk about this and spread the word. Just because of the level of sophistication and planning that went into this attack, I try to detail out as much as possible, but I've also dropped a link for anybody who's interested in reading more about this particular attack and wants to dig deeper into the technical implications of how this attack was executed. But for all of the general purposes, for a very high level overview of what this attack was and what it did. So like I outlined in my previous slide, that the attackers were able to get into 3 energy provider systems in Ukraine, and they were able to compromise it for a length of up to 6 hours. And here's the timeline of how this really happened. And this is a very well-defined or well-structured attack. If you look at the stages of this particular attack, this is just a textbook definition of how one should approach an attack. So the very first thing that we do in any kind of attack scenario or want to get into a system, the first thing that you would do is recon. In this, you identify your target. You select your target. You make sure the attack triggered. So in this particular scenario, the attack triggered when an employee open an Excel attachment. There's still a debate between if it was an Excel attachment or Word attachment. So let's just go with Excel at this point. In their email, that was intended, indeed, a variant of the Black Energy 3 malware. So Black Energy 3 is, like I mentioned in the previous slides, that it's just a malware toolkit. And it's not new at this time. This is happening in 2015, but we've already seen some of these some of the uses of black energy back in 2014 in different parts of the world. And this is just an extension or the use case very specifically built for this attack. So here the attacker has identified that they want to take down Ukrainian utility providers, electricity utility providers. And they then start trying to target these employees who work at these 3 energy companies. One thing to note here is a lot of times, many of these employees were actually working for multiple companies, because in Ukraine, there are, I think, 27 regions, provinces, and there are multiple companies that kind of serve through each of these regions. So it often happened that one individual employee would actually be servicing more than one electrical company. So the email, the phishing email that many of these employees received could actually be relevant to them because they were cross-functionally working with so many electrical companies. So it seemed legit, and the person actually clicked on the attachment that came with that email. Whether an Excel or a doc file, a Word file, it actually threw up a pop-up that asked the employee to kind of enable macros. And at this point, Black Energy malware was at play, and it was installed on the system. The next thing was to weaponize. Once you identify your target, you know who and where you want to get into, you start weaponizing that. So you launched your attack by sending a phishing email to many of these employees, and some of them happen to click it. We also have a lot of spam filters, protections on the email itself, but these are not a foolproof. Again, it's relational, that most times they will capture it. But if this is a new form of phishing email that they have not seen in the past, it's possible that this phishing email will get through to the employee and they will happen to click on it. So I would also want to call out here, one of the things that we should, best practices that are considered in cybersecurity domain is that we train our staff, or we train our employee strength, or we educate people who are going to be using the system to not do such a thing. That's why we have security trainings, we have cybersecurity classes, where they kind of especially emphasize on when you see an attachment or a URL, never click if you don't recognize the source. And that is what exactly happened here. Had this employee not clicked on this, none of this would actually happen. At least not in the manner that it did. There could be other ways that they could get into the system. But here we are. The employee actually clicked on the link on the file, and the Black Energy malware was on the system. Now, what this really does, this malware does, is it then started doing a vertical and a horizontal scan of the machine in the same network. So the malware launched from an infected Excel sheet and established the footholds in the compromised system. So it first got hold on the same system that it was clicked on, and then it started doing a network scan and the system scan, hardware scan, and then reporting back to something that we call as command and control center, C2C. And then based on that, the attackers actually understood how the internal systems or operations were. They're scoping out what the internal infrastructure looks like, and then starting to target their particular attack in the ways that they can get to their end goal of compromising the entire system. And look at the planning that they're doing here. I know I kind of sound like a fanboy here, but in most cases, you would see an attack not so thoroughly well planned. But here, the initial systems and the networks were compromised 8 months ahead of the attack. So all of this did not happen overnight. This was not a weekend project, or this was not just by chance. This was very well crafted and very, very sophisticated attack. So the initial email that came in, and they might have been trying even before that, but that was when they got their breakthrough. They were able to get their exploit or the malware installed on one machine. They started scoping out the machine. All of this is happening, remember, all of this is happening 8 months ahead of the actual attack that they actually plan on doing, when they feel they're ready and all the things that they need in place are there. They started to look at the control system networks. So at this time, when they compromised machine, they only have access to the enterprise network. And maybe I'm speaking ahead of myself, but in the next slide, we'll see that this particular Ukrainian electrical utility board actually had good security measures in place. So the control network systems and the host mapping was completed using the malware that they installed. And then this particular malware started to spread around vertically. So in computer networks, when we say vertically, that means that the system is not able to escalate to another network in another directory, or is not able to escalate its privileges. If it is too complicated or too technical, don't worry about it. It's not really important. What you need to understand is if there are multiple machines in one network, the malware is able to traverse from one machine to another without any problems. And then it starts distributing itself on other machines on that same network. That is what delivering is the delivery step does. The next one we have here is exploiting. This is when we actually start taking advantage of the machine, or actually start playing around or planting things that are not intended to be there in the first place. So the very first thing that they did was they did rewrite the DMS framework. So the DMS is nothing but a distribution management system. And do note that all of these electrical companies, and these are 3 different companies altogether, right? So they have different kind of DMS services installed on them. So the attacker actually identified each of these different DMS on each of these 3 companies, and was able to write a custom firmware and deploy it on those machines. And remember, this is not triggering anything at this time. They just have the firmware ready. This is the operation specific or custom firmware that was built for these machines, and they have it ready to be deployed. And they've updated these firmwares by rewriting the original version of it. But this is not doing anything yet. They also disabled the remote reclose break command. Again, on the verge of sounding very technical, what a breaker command does is basically breaker open means the connection is through and the electricity is flowing through. And if the breaker is closed, that means the electricity is not flowing through, just like a switch, but for an entire grid. So if you were to turn on or off the switch, the entire subsystem's electric distribution would stop. So the implication of this would be huge. So what they're doing here is they are going to, so the particular mechanism where somebody remotely can reclose the breaker command they're breaking this particular mechanism. And this is not going to have any implication on the existing operation because nobody on a daily basis tries to do this remotely. There are people who are operating this electrical substation in person manually. And we'll see how they are now taking away one after another controls from the people who are actually in control, and they themselves get into, they meaning the attackers, get into the control seat and start getting controls of the system one after another. They also uploaded additional attack modules, such as kill disk. So kill disk is a utility. Think of it like a tool that wipes away your system. And the speciality of this particular tool is that it can also wipe away critical system files. So if you're on a Windows machine, if you try to go right click on your C drive, don't do this. But if you right click on your C drive and try to format it, your system is going to prevent you from doing it because it has critical operation files. It also has something called an MBR, master boot record. So you cannot wipe these critical piece of information. You can always wipe away something that has optional parameters. So what this kill disk is going to do is it's going to be able to kill or basically wipe away all critical files on a file system. So even if you reboot the system, in most cases, what happens is if your system crashes, you reboot it and a lot of problems are fixed automatically because the critical or the core of the operating system is never compromised. In this case, if we actually erase some of the files from the critical directories, we might not even be able to reboot it. So this is what they're doing here. They're deploying a kill disk utility. And this is, again, not being triggered at this time, but it is ready for execution. So it is just waiting on a command. The minute it gets the command, it's going to wipe the whole disk and the system is not going to come back up ever again. At least not without reinstalling the applications or reinstalling the operating system. The next thing that they do is they reconfigure the UPS load outage. So what a UPS does is, say, for example, this is very similar to, I'm not sure if how many of you have actually used a desktop, but if you had a desktop, you would have a UPS. That's nothing but uninterrupted power supply. That would act as a backup in case your actual power supply from the wall unit is killed for whatever reason or interrupted for a small period of time. So when you reconfigure the UPS is used to power the power systems at the electrical companies. So in a power outage condition, at least the operation center would always have power. That was the design or the use case for the UPS. And when they reconfigure it, they make sure that when the actual power goes out, even the electrical company's operation center would not have any power. So if you were to bring that system back up, there's going to be no power there. So that is what they're deploying here. So these are all the kill switches they're putting in place, but they're not executing on any of them just yet. They then establish a remote connection to the operator's HMI at target. So HMI is nothing but a human machine interface. So think of it like an actual physical machine where you can press buttons and that would execute a command or basically take an action. So this is where your power distribution on the grid happens. So the HMI machines is where the operator sits and decides where power is going to go. And they usually have a system or a network that is disconnected from the corporate network. And that was exactly the case in this particular scenario, where all three of these electrical companies had very good security in place. They had their corporate network separate from their critical system network and or the SCADA network, I should say, at this point. So they were able to establish access to the HMI. And how they were able to do this is when they installed the Black Energy malware on one of the systems, they navigated through all of the corporate network machines. They were installing all of this malware on all of those machines. But when they tried to enter into the SCADA machine or the critical system machine, so these two networks were physically different and they did not have access into each other easily. So they were protected by a firewall, which is a very good security mechanism in place. So what these attackers did indeed was they were not able to bypass the firewall. And if they tried too hard, they would be identified. So a lot of times you need to be, what's very important when you're getting into a machine or hacking into a machine is you need to maintain your stealth mode. You need to make sure that nobody notices that you're there, because the minute somebody identifies that there is something wrong in the machine, they will start taking countermeasures, and that exposes the risk of being identified. So they don't want at this stage in their attack. They're already too deep into it. They're very heavily invested. They have most of their kill switches in place. So at this point, they don't want to be identified. So what they do is when they're not able to get from their corporate network into the SCADA network is they actually look at the Windows domain controller. Remember I mentioned this term to you earlier in our presentation, which maintains nothing but the network users account information, authentication mechanisms. So they start scraping this information and they get a lot of network users account and credentials to the VPN that can help them VPN into the SCADA system. So instead of breaking through or trying to brute force into the SCADA system through the firewall, they were actually able to get the credentials of the users who were the employees of the electrical company, and then log in, basically just like a valid use case user. They were able to log in into the SCADA network. And look at their foresight here. So when they log in into the system, they actually change the original password. So when the actual user, even who has the access to this machine, tries to log into the system, the machine will not allow these members to get in because the password would have been changed at that time. So these attackers then change the password to the SCADA networks of the people that they had used to access it so that nobody can disrupt their access. Then they also go out to set up a TDOS dialer. This is beyond brilliant at this point. TDOS is nothing but they then start calling their helpline numbers. So the electrical utility companies' helpline numbers were flooded with spam calls. So imagine that if your phone had been receiving thousands of calls nonstop on your number, you would either answer a few of them, and then at that point you would realize all of these are scam. So even if a good user actually called, you would not be able to answer it or not be able to get to it, or your phone would not be available at all for the good user to actually reach you to begin with. So this is what they're doing here. They're setting up a TDOS dialer. So when the time is right and when they activate the attack, the customer care line, or basically the number that reports an outage for this to this electrical company's service center, is actually disabled and is being flooded with the spam calls. So with all of this now in place, they have access to the SCADA network. They have all of their kill switches in place. They also have a TDOS dialer set up so that when they're executing the attack, nobody's able to reach to these guys. So now comes the moment of execution. So at this time, they have all the modules in place. The first thing that they do is they actually log into the HMI machine. So that is nothing but the controller's machine, which controls the power through the grid. So the operator on the other side is actually looking at the screen and he sees his mouse cursor move. Quite literally, he's sitting in front of the screen and he's not touching the mouse, but his mouse cursor is moving. This is how remote controls operate, remote connections operate. And he then sees that the cursor is pointing to a grid and is being disconnected, or the grid is being taken offline. And he tries to take control of the mice by like moving it erratically or trying to press all the keys on the keyboard. But he then realizes that all of this is unresponsive and all he could do is nothing but sit back and watch what's happening on the screen. When the user actually tried to restart the machine and log in as himself, he actually got kicked out because remember that the attackers had actually changed the passwords of the real users. So when the real user or the operator wanted to get in the machine, they were not even able to get in the machine after the restart of the system. So at this point, the entire system is under the control of the attacker. They then go ahead and execute the TDOS, which starts dialing on their customer care line. And no good user, so the consumers or the people who actually consume electricity from these electrical companies are trying to call into these electrical companies, but they're not able to reach them. And so these guys don't know that there is an outage happening outside. So the time that the operator actually realized that they're taking down the grid was already too late. They had already taken down several grids at this point, and they continue to do that over the period of time. They also executed the same command that they had installed in the first place, a custom firmware that they had installed, that they then issue a command to open the breakers. This basically disconnects the grid from the consumers, creating a huge outage. They also modified the field device firmware. So what this does is once the device firmware is modified, they are able to execute command remotely on these machines, even if they do not have, or even if the systems were restarted, or somebody else manually took control, they were able to disable this or execute a remote command on these firmware machines without any problem. Like I mentioned, they then executed the TDOS. Nobody could reach them and tell them there's an outage. And then they scheduled the UPS to go down. So this means that they first took down the power of all the customers from the grid, and then they shut down the grid itself. The operating center of the grid was taken down, and the UPS did not kick back in. And at the same time, they also executed the kill disk utility that we were discussing in the past. So this started wiping out the machines that were compromised of all the files and folders on those machines, and then they shut down the power. So now there's two problems. In the control center, there is no power. The machines that they have in front of them are practically useless because there is no files that could actually help them restore the functionality. And the firmware that they have access to, which actually controls the grid, is being now controlled by somebody remotely. So this entire exercise basically left the operators as spectators in front of these machines, and they could do nothing but just watch the entire system from being taken offline. So the system, and as a final stage of this, the system outage existed. This triggered cyber asset restoration. So every company has, every good company who has a healthy hygiene in terms of security has a restoration plan in place, even before such an incident actually happens. So they have a runbook in an event of such a failure, what to do. So all of those assertions, all those restoration services came into play. They were able to restore the service in a very constrained manner. So they just started operating on a minimal scale, that whatever they needed, whichever systems that they needed to restore the power were the only systems that they brought back up on. And they made sure that they disconnected from the network so that no remote access was allowed. Electrical system restoration using manual mode. So they had to actually physically go in to restore the UPSs and restore the power to the service operation center. And at the same time, then replace the existing UPS with the new UPSs so that they can actually have the original firmware that they had to restore power in the service center. And this entire exercise actually took over 6 hours to kind of restore power. And like I mentioned, this is all happening in December in Russia, where the weather gets really cold. And when you look at the impact of this outage, we've noticed that there were 2.3 lakh people who were impacted, and a good amount of them actually ended up in hospitals. And not to mention that a lot of hospitals also faced outages, though they have power backups. But this was a very, very serious attack that was organized in a very sophisticated manner, something that the world had never seen before. At this point, I would like to take a pause, visit any questions that we might have, and then go back. Ma'am, do we have any questions?
Not so far, Neerav. I request participants, if you have any questions, please post it either in the chat box or I can provide the mic if you request so.
Perfect. All right. So a few quick call outs that I wanted to make here, that after all of this incident happened, there were extensive research and investigation that actually took place. And digital forensic research is one of the domains that you can actually enter in cybersecurity if you're interested. So in this particular field, you actually take apart a damaged hard drive or a damaged network or a damaged computer, and then try to recreate or restore services, even if the actual operating system or the software installed on top of that is not working. There are a lot of mechanisms. So you might have seen this in a lot of movies where you see a hard drive is burnt to ashes, but it goes to a forensic team and they're able to restore a lot of the data from that. So such kind of investigation actually happened here, where the forensic team came in to see, even when the devices were wiped out, there's always a way to restore it. In most cases, they're able to restore most of the data on the hard drives. So when they actually took the investigation into the Ukrainian operators' security controls, it points out that they had very, very good security mechanisms in place. One of it being they had very strong enforcement of non-obvious passwords. The second thing was the firewall. The firewall that they had with strict data flow restrictions was in place. So it was not easy to get around this. And that we noticed that they were able to do with using Windows domain controller. The last thing is that they have extensive logging. This is a very good sign. A lot of times you don't see that, especially in infrastructure systems like these. They don't have good logging mechanisms. So it's very difficult to go back and trace what happened. But because this security control systems had extensive logging in place, they were able to retrace the entire path of the attacker and recover a lot of these details that we're discussing today. That is pretty much all the call outs I have from this particular attack. I know there was a question around this, but I just wanted this quote out there so that everybody has read this. Time is what determines security. With enough time, nothing is unhackable. So most systems are secure for X amount of time. So every time you actually read through any of the cryptographic algorithms, you will see that these they require a finite amount of calculation if you were to brute force into that algorithm to come up with a solution or actually get the key. Usually this time frame is if the entire world's computing power was put to use, it would usually take 70 to 80 years to break into these systems of this crypto algorithms. That is why it is still in use, because they only last for a couple of seconds. The challenges are usually for a couple of seconds. So with enough time in computation, no system is unbreachable. All right. So in summary, this was a brilliant hack, extremely sophisticated and carefully handcrafted attack. It is also believed, looking at the investigation logs, it turns out that much of these components were actually built by different individual attackers. So not entire attack chain was built by the same attacker or same small set of people. So there were multiple people who collaborated, and that is the assumption, looking at the attack pattern, that there were multiple bad actors that came together to kind of execute this at such a scale. And this was also the first time ever that an operation-specific firmware was built and deployed to exploit a target of this size. So ever since then, a lot of systems have taken note or cues from this particular incident and have tried to make their operations much secure. But I just wanted to leave it as a food of thought for people who think that such critical system, if hacked in the right way, they could bring in catastrophe. Imagine if this was a nuclear power station and they were somehow able to execute that the system generate more power and at the same time disconnect them from the grid. That would actually heat up the whole place, and the whole power station would be destroyed, and it will actually leave out nuclear radiations out in the air. So a lot of things can happen with systems, especially the modern era that we are entering, where we don't need to exfiltrate or infiltrate into somebody's physical borders to cause damage. And as time surpasses, you will see that a lot of these attacks will become commonplace. And this is just one of the many attacks that have happened in the past. There are other attacks that have had major impact on critical systems, and there's no way to identify where did this come from. We have a lot of clues, we have a lot of identifiers, but a lot of time the attackers are really good at hiding their footsteps. So these attackers are able to get away with it. And this could also be used, just a tangential conversation. Such attacks can also be used to exploit an existing human vulnerability. So when I say a human vulnerability, for example, is there are two countries, country A and country B, who don't like each other. In this case, Ukraine and Russia, for example. This entire attack was staged in a way to show that this attack came from Russia. So what this would actually do is aggravate people's anger in Ukraine against Russia, and they would actually go to a physical war. Now that they are going, had we seen this in the past, but this actually brings two countries or two parties at conflict in the real world when something like this happens. So it may or may not be an act of Russia. I do not know that information yet, but what it actually ended up doing is it actually created hatred in the real world, and it brought about a lot of conflict between the two countries. which may be unwarranted at this point. So that is why this bleeds into the title of this today's presentation, where we talk about weapons of modern warfare, how well they are crafted and how sophisticated they're built. A lot can be achieved, and it could have catastrophic implications on our real world lives. At this point, I would like to stop and open the house for questions, comments. That's pretty much all I had for today. Thank you very much.
Hello, Neerav.
Hi, ma'am.
There are a few set of questions. Rakshit wants to ask, if my phone is completely encrypted, then in forensics, will I able to restore data from it or decrypt it?
So there are two questions here. If your phone is encrypted and damaged, yes, in forensics, you will be able to restore a lot of the data as is. So when I say as is, it is in still in the encrypted form. To decrypt it is a different problem altogether, depending on what kind of security algorithm was used to encrypt it. It depends on how challenging that it is going to be to decrypt it. There are a lot of existing toolkits that are available, and Rakshit, I would recommend that you go ahead and read the special case Apple versus FBI for your case study. I think that's a very good example. Just to give you a high-level summary of what really happened there is, FBI actually found an iPhone that runs iOS of a terrorist who actually had executed some terrorist activities in San Bernardino, LA, California. And the US government actually wanted Apple to install a custom update on the terrorist's phone so that they are able to look into the data and the information around what did the terrorist have on their phone. But Apple took a privacy standpoint and said that we will not be able to do this, because if we do this for one user, we are compromising the security of everybody else, because then there's nobody who's going to trust us. But in the end, after a lot of conflict, a public heated debate around against each other, FBI was still able to get this phone decrypted from the black market or ways unknown, but they were able to get around it. So again, like I mentioned, there's no security that is unreachable. It is only about how much resource and time you have and how much money do you have at your disposal.
Neerav, yes, another question from Rakshit. No, it's not a question actually. From Kush, he wants to ask, what are your views on the NASA cybersecurity attack?
I'm not aware of the specific use case here, but if there's a more particular pertinent question around any use case, I would be happy to answer, but I'm not sure what Kush is trying to refer to. I haven't read on this NASA cybersecurity attack. Is that the security posture of NASA in general against cyber attacks? Kush, if you're on the call, if not, I'm happy to chat with you offline after this presentation.
Kush, could you be more specific of your question? If you need a mic, I can provide you so. I guess there is no response from him, Neerav.
I think he's trying to unmute himself.
Yes, Kush, you can unmute. I will unmute you. Wait, just a second. You can unmute. Kush, kindly unmute yourself.
Hello, sir. I want to ask about the NASA security breach that took NASA 21 days to recover from that.
Yeah, I'm not particularly aware of this particular use case, but yeah, a lot of times what happens is these are called stealth mode, and like I tried to touch upon in my presentation, a lot of these attacks stay there for a very long time. So in the case study that we just did, we realized that the attackers were in the system for 8 months and they were undetected. So a lot of times the attackers are in the system without any presence or any signs of obvious notice. So they're able to live through the system, navigate through the system, explore what vulnerabilities exist in the system, and they start mapping those things out. So 21 days is a very good use case, very good time frame in terms to recover from such an attack. Sometimes there are attackers who are pertinently in your system for over years. There have been use cases or the attacks where the attackers were in the system for about 4 years, and they were exfiltrating a small amount of data on a daily basis. So it took 7 to 8 years for them to exfiltrate the whole data that they were actually intending to do. So the attackers' patience are key here. If they are very patient and they are disciplined about how they want to get into the system and how they want to get out of the system, sometimes they are undetectable for a very, very long period of time. So 21 days is really not bad. And at least that is what they know. There might be case where they are not able to. So 21 days is based on the first sign of incidents, whatever the signal was, and they look back since when was the signal in the system. There could be other signals that they have not identified that could have been in the system for much longer than that.
I want to also that if hackers are so much intelligent, why can't they be the asset for the system than destroying the system or breaching the system?
So that's a good point, and that's also for an attacker to answer. But let me give you a perspective on that. So there are not all hackers are bad hackers. There's classes of hackers. There's some people that are known as white hat hackers. So they actually exploit the system just to expose its vulnerabilities. So for example, you tell me today, hey, can you exploit my machine and give me a report of all the vulnerabilities that you see? And this is called pen testing. This is a field in cybersecurity where you would pay a company or an individual to actually break into your system, and then they will give you a detailed report on how did they actually get into your report in your system. So these hackers are classified under good hackers, and they actually are an asset to a company or a country. But a lot of times, like I mentioned in the initial slides that I presented, the motivation could be monetary, strictly monetary, or they could be fueled by some form of revenge against the entity they're trying to get into. So under those circumstances, it's really hard to kind of have the attackers run by the ethics.
And can every type of attack be prevented or controlled?
Yes. See, there are two parts to it. One, once the attack, there is something called a 0 day. So unless something like this has happened in the past, there is no way for us to know that such a vulnerability exists in the system. So once such an incident happens, that is called the 0 day of that particular vulnerability. And once a attack is identified, then there are mechanisms that are designed by the defensive side. That's the good people or people who are trying to build secure systems. They start devising mechanisms to identify such vulnerabilities in other systems as well. So there needs to have been one presence of that attack known to public. Like I mentioned, there are attacks that go on for years, or there are exploits that go on for years, and they're never known. One good example of that could be the vulnerability that we have in SSL. That's considered to be a secure channel. Every time you see HTTPS on your browser, you consider it to be secure. But if you look at the vulnerability in 1.0.1e, let me type this in chat. I think that is a version. SSL. All right, ignore all the extra dots, but that's a version that had vulnerabilities. So this was considered to be a secure system until it was not. And people were, you might have read in the news, over dramatic news that said that the whole internet is broken, the systems, every secure system is broken, and they need to upgrade it overnight. So this was that one bigger vulnerability. So once an attack is seen for the first time, after that it can be defended, yes. But unless somebody has actually seen that for the first time, you cannot defend such an attack. Or it is, I would say it is very difficult to defend such an attack.
Participants, any more questions? I guess, Neerav, that's it.
Sounds good. I also have a chat message from Rakshit. I'm not sure if this is for everybody or just for me. but he's asking suggestions around an open source forensic tool.
Forensics.
Useful for us while doing forensics. Rakshit, I would recommend that I don't have a specific tool as such because I don't know what your use case is, but I would recommend that you download Kali Linux. Let me also type that here. That comes in with a lot of open source tools pre-built into it for you to kind of play around and explore. So depending on what you're trying to do with that open source tool, there are different tools for different kind of use cases. And a lot of it comes pre-fit in this particular flavor of Linux. All right, I think we've gone through everything.
We are open to the questionnaire participants. Any more questions? Yes, Neerav, I think it's done. Definitely,
Right.
it was an eye-opener session, Neerav, on how if such cyber attacks occur, it can be massive and much more dangerous than actual military warfare, because it comes down to the nation's security. It
Right.
was a great session indeed.
Of course, thank you very much. I think for that very reason, most of the countries in the world are actually working to building their cyber defense very strongly. A lot of times you would see that when two countries go on conflict, the other country starts breaching into their systems, and most systems are not as secure as we want them to be at all times because it's an expensive affair. So definitely something to look out for in the future. And if you're pursuing a career in cybersecurity, I think there's never going to be a better time than this. Good luck to everybody who's on the call, and share friends and family. Do share the slides with them or the perspective.
Thank you, Neerav. Happy to have you, Neerav. And I'm very sure that the participants will be immensely benefited by your session.